Hello and welcome to my Yu-Gi-Oh channel. In today's video we're going to be covering the top 5 spells I believe are going to be needed for Pendulum monsters within the new Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links Arc 5 world. Pendulum Treasure is a normal spell card with the effect add one Pendulum monster from your deck to your extra deck face up. You can only activate one Pendulum Treasure once per turn. The purpose of this card is it basically searches out from the deck to the extra deck, which means that it's much easier to then bring that card out, even if it does have to go to, say, for example, an extra monster zone. It's much easier than that than for having to run random cards to search. Instead, this tends to work with absolutely any of the Pendulum decks. It's not limited to type or attribute. I don't see this card as having any real downsides outside of whatever Konami assumes to be doing within Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. I think they're not going to be heavily nerfing them to begin with, but over time they might adapt things and the styles. And again, you can watch theories 1, 2 and 3 to give my overall opinions as to what's going to happen. The next card we're covering is Pot of Riches. This is a normal spell card with the effect shuffle 3 Pendulum monsters into the deck from your graveyard and or face up from your extra deck, then draw 2 cards. You can only activate one Pot of Riches per turn. You cannot special summon the turn you activate this card except by Pendulum Summon. This is basically a Pot of Greed but specific to Pendulum monsters. Whilst I can imagine a lot of people be saying this is overly broken, oh you can't be doing this, drawing into multiple cards is not very good idea. You already have cards that do that. You already have Pot of Greed, which comes through, I think, Jane Yuki's skill, where he can get some very broken cards. I'm sure there are also other cards. I think there is another one which is for Xyz monsters, which lets you draw an additional 2 cards if you've got 2 monsters of the same level. So don't pretend these cards don't already exist for more specific decks. The beauty of this is this would provide is specifically for Pendulum monsters. Not only would it have the Pot of Avarice effect to be able to shuffle your Pendulum monsters from the graveyard back into the deck, but it also affects your extra deck. So if you don't have the ability to really recover those cards normally from the extra deck, now here's your answer. Drawing into 2 additional cards still means you're actually going into a +1, so you're not going overly far in advantage, but it does have that benefit that is reliant within Pendulum cards. You might go through your resources too quickly. The only downside is it does limit you to only being able to special summon for the turn with Pendulum Summoning. Therefore, if you're unlucky enough to try and bank on drawing into Pendulum scales, and you either draw into the wrong scales, you draw into one of the scales and not the other, or potentially you draw into just spell and trap cards that don't actually benefit you in any way for that time, then that is a quite heavy risk on just relying on this card. Wavering Eyes is a quick play spell card with the effect destroy as many cards in each player's Pendulum zones as possible, then apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of cards destroyed by this effect. 1. Inflict 500 damage to your opponent. 2. You can add 1 Pendulum monster from your main deck to your hand. 3. You can banish 1 card on the field, and 4. You can add 1 Wavering Eyes from your deck to your hand. Now, a lot of people would question why you would have such a powerful card being introduced so quickly into the game. My answer to that is you've got so many cards already that have been introduced that are very powerful and can counter various types of monsters, be it Xyz monsters, fusion monsters, ritual monsters, synchro monsters, and so why should this get any special treatment? This works at both rewarding you and punishing you at the same time. It does destroy your scales, so actually if you're a Pendulum player, this can affect you heavily, but it also in turn, counters your opponent's Pendulum cards. It's also beneficial because it protects your cards if you're running something that doesn't happen to be a Pendulum deck, and it gives you some way of, resisting against that being power creeped. The effects themselves, I'll cover them briefly, but it's nothing too complicated to work out. The inflict 500 damage, that's halved because of the new rulings to do with Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Links. That will burn damage is half. The ability to add a Pendulum monster from the main deck to your hand, it's good because you can add anything. It may have a certain effect that you might need, or even just for its scale. scales. The third effect is just banish a card on the field. There's a number of cards that actually do that for certain archetypes. There's a photon version of it. There's also one for the Valkyrie monsters as well. And so I don't think this is overly broken. It's just a nice version for Pendulum monsters. And the final one happens to be to add a Wavering Eyes from your deck to your hand. This means you can actually just search for another one of these cards and then hopefully use it potentially within the next turn. I would say the only way you can get the third and fourth effect is if you and your opponent are running Pendulum monsters. Therefore, I would advise running this in a pure Pendulum build. Otherwise, you are only relying on basically the first effect, because unlikely you're going to have Pendulum monsters randomly sitting in your deck. Smile Universe is a quick play spell card with the effect special summon as many face-up Pendulum monsters from your extra deck as possible, but they have their effects negated if any. Then your opponent gains life points equal to the total original attack of those special summon monsters. You cannot normal or special summon other monsters or attack during the turn you activate this effect. I think this card is actually quite reasonable to have, although it does basically summon a load of your Pendulum monsters that have been essentially destroyed and sent to the extra deck. It's fine. Your monsters lose their abilities. That means they just become vanilla monsters. Your opponent gains life points equal to the total original attack of those monsters, which means you're not OTKing them. You are getting the benefit of those monsters anyway. And you cannot normal or special summon other monsters for the rest of that turn, which means there are decent enough protections from your opponent, whilst not becoming too dominant for them either. It's not too much of a benefit. It pumps up their life points, but if they're not running anything that costs them life points, it might not really make that much difference. And the final card I'd be hoping for is Soul Pendulum. This is a continuous spell card with the effect you can target 2 cards in your Pendulum zones, change each target's Pendulum scale by 1 as a minimum 1. You can only use this effect of Soul Pendulum once per turn. Each time your Pendulum monster is Pendulum summoned, place 1 counter on this card. Pendulum monsters on the field gain 300 attack for each counter on this card. You can remove 3 counters from this card. During your main phase this turn, you can conduct 1 Pendulum summon of other monsters in addition to your Pendulum summon. You can only gain this effect once per turn. So the purpose of this card is it adjusts your Pendulum scales. That might be useful if they've got certain restrictions or they happen to be quite high scales and don't give you a variety of monsters you can summon from within. That's the purpose of it. It also encourages you to actually Pendulum summon, because the more times you do that, the more counters are generated and the more attack points that your Pendulum monsters will gain, 300 times the number of Pendulum counters on this card. So if you're able to Pendulum summon multiple times, within about 3 turns, that's an additional 900 attack points, which isn't bad. I'd say as well, if you happen to lose and have 3 counters, you're able to Pendulum summon once again within the turn. That means even if your opponent is trying to do something against you, you can counteract that with this effect. Overall, my suggestions are, considering that these 5 cards are relevant Pendulum summoning, relevant for the time being, and I would expect at least 1 or 2 of them to make the list of cards we might see, whether that be in a card trader or as a main booster set. What do you guys think of these cards? Personally for me, the one that I'd like to see the most is Pot of Riches, because it's like a pot greed for Pendulum monsters. The one I'm least likely to think is going to be revealed, not the one that I hate the most, just the one that I think they're going to hold off on for a little bit longer, is Wavering Eyes, just because they don't want something that's going to destroy Pendulum monsters the second it comes out. It would essentially be like running Dimensional Barrier the second you introduce Exceeds monsters into the game, because that's a way of countering those monsters. Whatever you guys think, leave those in the comments down below, like the video if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe for more daily Yu-Gi-Oh content.